Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku was the last hero alive after the end of the world? Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The first thing to return was the pain. It was not a sharp, intrusive agony, but a low, thrumming ache that resonated deep in his bones, a dull chorus of every fracture, every tear, every overextended sinew he had ever suffered. It was an old, familiar pain, the price of his borrowed power, and in a strange way, it was comforting. It was proof. The second thing was the dust. It coated his tongue, a gritty film of pulverized concrete and ancient sorrow. It clogged his nostrils, carrying the scent of ozone, rust, and something else, something like dry, sterile decay. A cough, ragged and weak, tore from his throat, sending a plume of the fine gray powder into the air. His eyes, sealed shut with a crusty residue, fluttered. Izuku Midoriya gasped, and the world, or what was left of it, cried hello. He was on the floor. Cold, smooth tile pressed against his cheek. His body felt alien, a gaunt and hollowed-out marionette whose strings had been cut. He tried to push himself up, but his arms, once capable of leveling city blocks, trembled under the weight of his own emaciated frame. The muscles had atrophied, withered away to little more than taut cords over bone. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to rise in his chest, but he was too weak even for that. Slowly, painfully, he levered himself into a sitting position, his back against a metal cabinet. His vision swam, a nauseating blur of white and gray. As it cleared, the room swam into focus. It was an infirmary. Not just any infirmary. The distinctive star-patterned tile, the high-tech medical beds, the faint, lingering scent of antiseptic buried under the dust. It was Recovery Girl's office. A fortified, underground version he vaguely remembered being part of UA's final defense protocols. The machines he was meant to be hooked up to stood silent sentinel around an empty bed. And 4 stand lay toppled, the bag attached to it shriveled and yellowed, its contents long since evaporated into a crystalline stain on the floor. Wires snaked from the dead monitors like amputated limbs. He had not been in the bed. He had been on the floor beside it, as if he'd simply fallen out. He looked down at himself. He was wearing the tattered remains of a standard-issue medical gown, brittle with age. Beside him, folded with a care that felt like a punch to the gut, was his hero costume, or what was left of it. The Gamma suit, once a marvel of support technology, was a wreck. The dark green fabric was scorched and torn, the arm braces were melted into slag on one side, and the iron soles of his boots were warped and peeling. His mask, the one that mirrored his idol's smile, was ripped clean down the middle, its grin a grotesque, broken thing. How long? The question echoed in the cavernous silence of his mind. How long had he been here? Days? Weeks? He ran a trembling hand through his hair. It was long, matted, and felt unnervingly dry. A thick, wiry beard, something he'd never been able to grow before, covered his jaw. Months then. Maybe longer. He pushed himself to his feet, using the cabinet for support. His legs shook like a newborn fawn's. A wave of vertigo sent him staggering, his hand shooting out to brace himself against the wall. That's when he saw his reflection in the darkened screen of a vital signs monitor. The face that stared back was not his own. It belonged to a ghost. Sunken cheeks, shadowed eyes that seemed too large for his skull, and a look of profound, world-weary confusion. He looked like one of the famine victims from the pre-Quirk-era history books. The only recognizable feature was the wild shock of green-black hair, now streaked with dust, and the constellation of freckles across his nose, faint against his pallid skin. Driven by a desperate, primal need for answers, he began to explore. The infirmary door was thick, a blast-proof slab of steel. It wasn't locked. It groaned open on rusted hinges, the sound deafening in the absolute quiet. The hallway beyond was just as still, just as cloaked in a fine layer of gray dust. Emergency lights, long since dead, hung from the ceiling. He walked, his bare feet making soft, slapping sounds on the grimy floor. Each step was an effort, a conscious command sent to muscles that screamed in protest. He passed classrooms, their doors ajar, revealing overturned desks and shattered windows that looked out onto solid rock. This was deep underground. As he walked, flickers of memory, sharp and brutal as shrapnel, began to pierce the fog in his mind. A scream, Eurarchus, as a wave of raw decay energy surged towards her. The flash of Bakugo's howitzer impact, a defiant star against the world-ending storm. Todoroki's wall of heavenly ice, vast as a mountain range, shattering like glass. Shigaraki. The name itself was a wound. He wasn't the petulant manchild from the USJ anymore. In the end, he had been something else. A complete fusion with All for One, a god of entropy, a hurricane of hatred-given flesh, his very presence causing the world to rot around him. He remembered the sky turning black, the ground crumbling to dust not from his touch, but from his sheer proximity. Izuku stumbled, pressing his forehead against the cool metal of a locker. The memories came faster now, a chaotic, non-linear assault. He remembered the vestiges of One for All, no longer just advisors, but a roaring chorus in his soul, their power surging through him like a supernova. You are the last ninth! The final barrier. The stern, pragmatic voice of the second user. Don't you dare die, kid! Make it count! Bakugo's voice, raw and desperate over the comms, before it cut to static. Izuku, be the hero we all know you are. Smile, and save them. Nana Shimura's voice, a tearful, gentle plea, and then All Might's. Not the booming symbol of peace, but the quiet, paternal voice of Tashinori Yagi, a whisper from the heart of the quirk. You've done enough, my boy. You've become the greatest hero. Now, I need you to do one last thing for me. Live, the final memory was the brightest, the most painful. He remembered seeing the remaining heroes, his friends, his teachers, creating a desperate, fleeting opening. He saw Shigaraki, bloated with stolen power, laughing as he unmade the world. And Izuku, with the combined will of 8 generations of heroes fueling him, had pulled on everything. Every ounce of power, every dreg of hope, every memory of every smile he had ever sworn to protect. He remembered the feeling of 1,000,000%. It wasn't a number. It was transcendence. It was the feeling of his own existence becoming a conduit for something absolute. His body, his mind, his soul, all of it burning away to fuel a single, impossible act. Delaware. Detroit. Smash. The impact didn't feel like it hit Shigaraki. It felt like it hit reality itself. A silent, white explosion that tore a hole in the world. He remembered a sensation of being unmade and remade all at once, the vestiges wrapping around his consciousness like a protective shroud, pulling him back from an abyss of pure, searing light. He was in a coma. He realized it with a sudden, chilling clarity. That final, desperate gambit hadn't just defeated Shigaraki. It had nearly annihilated him, too. The vestiges, their power expended, must have used the last of their collective energy to create a stasis, a healing cocoon to piece his body and soul back together while the world what? He reached the end of the bunker corridor. A massive, circular vault door stood ajar, a slice of strange, orange light cutting through the gloom. The air that seeped through was warm, dry, and carried that same scent of dust and desolation. With a grunt of effort, he pushed the heavy door open further, stepping out of the tomb of Yue, and into the graveyard of the world. He was standing on the precipice of a crater. The Yue he knew was gone. The grand main building, a symbol of hero society for generations, was a hole in the ground so vast it defied comprehension. The crater's edges were smooth, vitrified into a dark, glassy substance. Where the 1A dorms once stood, there were only the skeletal, concrete foundations, twisted and warped by impossible heat. The sky was not blue. It was a uniform, oppressive dome of burnt orange, a bruised twilight that seemed to have been frozen in place for years. The sun was a pale, indistinct disk, its light struggling to pierce the thick, particulate haze that choked the atmosphere. Strange, mutated flora grew everywhere. Thick, pulpy vines, some pulsing with a faint, sickly bioluminescence, coiled around the skeletons of buildings. Moss of a deep, unnatural crimson carpeted the ground in patches. The air was still, unnervingly so. No birdsong, no distant traffic, no wind rustling through leaves, because there were no leaves, only the fleshy, alien growths. The silence was a physical presence, a weight on his eardrums. He walked, his bare feet crunching on soil that felt like powdered glass. He moved through the ruins of the campus, a ghost haunting his own past. He saw the remains of the support course workshop, its walls peeled back like a sardine can. He saw the petrified, blackened stumps that had once been the trees lining the main path. He had won. He must have. Shigaraki was gone. That final, cataclysmic burst of power had surely been enough. So where was everyone? Where were the rescue teams? The cleanup crews? Where were the cheers, the tears of relief, the reporters? He needed to see more. He needed a higher vantage point. Izuku took a deep, shuddering breath. He closed his eyes, reaching inward, searching for the familiar wellspring of power. It was there, but it felt different. Quieter. A calm, deep reservoir instead of a raging river. He focused, letting a sliver of it flow into his legs and up his spine. Float. His feet lifted from the ground. It was clumsy, shaky. He wobbled in the air, a far cry from the effortless flight he had once mastered. But it held. He rose, slowly, ascending above the wreck of his school, his heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs. He rose higher and higher, until the ruins of Yui were just a scar on the landscape below. And then he saw it. The world he had fought to save was gone. Musudafu was not a city. It was a corpse. A sprawling necropolis of skeletal skyscrapers, collapsed highways, and rubble-choked streets stretching to every horizon. The Kanto region, a bustling heart of civilization, was a uniform sea of rust-brown and gray ruin, punctuated by the eerie glow of the mutated forests. There were no lights. No moving vehicles, no plumes of smoke from chimneys. No signs of life whatsoever. A vast, black scorch mark, miles wide, radiated out from the Yui crater, a testament to the sheer, world-breaking power he had unleashed. He won the battle, but he had lost the world. The realization was not a thought. It was a physical blow. The air was punched from his lungs. The quiet strength of float evaporated. He tumbled from the sky, a ragged doll dropped from a great height. He didn't even have the presence of mind to brace himself. He simply fell, crashing into the soft, crimson moss with a dull thud that barely registered over the roaring in his ears. He lay there, face down in the dirt, as the totality of his failure washed over him. He hadn't saved them. He had simply outlived them. The final hero in a world with no one left to save. What was the point of his survival? What was the point of All Might's final wish? To live, yes, but to live for what? To be the sole king of this kingdom of dust and silence? A sob, dry and guttural, escaped his lips. Then another. Soon, he was convulsing on the ground, not weeping, but racked with a grief so profound it had no tears. It was a raw, animal sound of pure agony, swallowed by the immense, indifferent silence of the dead world. He screamed for his mother. For All Might. For Ida, Uraraka, Todoroki, Kirishima, Bakugo. He screamed their names into the dust until his throat was raw, and the only answer was the echo of his own despair. He was the last one. The sole survivor. The silent saint of a church with no congregation. How much time passed he didn't know. It could have been minutes or hours. Time had lost all meaning. He eventually pushed himself up, his movements stiff and robotic. There was one last place. A desperate, foolish pilgrimage he had to make. He began the long, slow walk toward the ruins of his old neighborhood. It was a journey through a nightmare landscape. He passed skeletons of cars, their paint peeled away, their interiors filled with drifted dust. He saw a playground, the swings moving gently in a phantom breeze, their chains groaning a lonely dirge. Finally, he stood before what was once his apartment building. It was a heap of concrete and twisted rebar. His home. The place his mother had always waited for him, a warm meal on the table and a worried smile on her face. He clawed through the rubble with numb fingers, not knowing what he was looking for. A photograph, a piece of furniture. Anything. His fingers brushed against a piece of singed, laminated cardboard, half buried in the debris. He pulled it out. It was an All Might trading card. The ultra-rare Silver Age debut card. His most prized possession as a child. The one he'd clutched in his hands as he watched the video of All Might's debut over and over, tears streaming down his face. You can become a hero! The card was scorched around the edges, the image of the smiling, triumphant hero faded and cracked. But it was intact. A single, stubborn relic of a world of hope. He sank to his knees, clutching the card to his chest. This time, the tears came. Hot, silent tears that traced clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. He wept for the small, quirkless boy who dreamed of being like All Might. He wept for the young hero who had inherited the world's greatest power. And he wept for the man he was now, a lonely ghost clutching a faded dream in the ruins of everything he had ever loved. He had failed them all. He pressed the card to his forehead, his body trembling with grief. The silence was absolute. The world was dead and empty. He was alone. Utterly and completely alone. And then, he felt it. It wasn't a spike. It wasn't the sharp, stabbing premonition of imminent harm he was used to. This was different. From the core of his being, from the vestige of the fourth user, his danger sense stirred from its long slumber. It awoke not with a shout, but with a whisper. A low, pervasive, constant hum. It was like the faint thrum of a distant engine, a vibration at the very edge of his perception. The world was not silent. The world was not empty. Something was out there. And it was aware. Izuku's head snapped up. His tears stopped. The grief, for a single, breathtaking moment, was replaced by a jolt of pure, ice-cold adrenaline. He slowly got to his feet, the scorched All Might card held tight in his fist. His wide, haunted eyes scanned the horizon of ruins, seeing nothing but devastation. But he could feel it. The hum persisted, a low-level static on the frequency of his soul, a sign that the story was not, in fact, over. He was the last hero. But he was not the last man. The hum was a compass. A single, unwavering note in a symphony of ruin, and it pointed him back towards the one place of relative safety he knew. Clutching the charred All Might card like a holy relic, Izuku began the painstaking journey back to the UA bunker. The jolt of adrenaline from his awakened danger sense had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness, but it had cauterized the raw, open wound of his grief. The pain was still there, a great, gaping void in his soul, but it was no longer all-consuming. It now had a companion, a cold, sharp-edged vigilance. He was not alone. The thought was both a comfort and a terror. The trek back was a slow, deliberate process. He was weaker than he had ever been since his first day of training with All Might, his atrophied muscles protesting every step. He navigated the treacherous landscape of his past, the silence of the world pressing in on him. Every gust of wind rattling a loose piece of sheet metal sounded like a footstep. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into a watching figure. The hum in his mind was his only guide, a low-frequency thrum that assured him he wasn't imagining things. There was life out there, and where there was life, there was danger. He finally stumbled back into the subterranean embrace of the bunker, sealing the heavy vault door behind him. The sudden return to absolute silence was jarring. The hum of danger sense lessened slightly, muted by the meters of rock and steel, but it remained, a persistent reminder of the world outside. He limped back to the infirmary, the ghost of Recovery Girl's presence a cold comfort. He needed answers. He needed counsel. He needed to not be alone in his own head. Sinking to the floor in the center of the room, he crossed his legs and closed his eyes. The world outside was a mystery, his own body was a stranger, and his power was a quiet, dormant thing. He reached inward, past the exhaustion and the sorrow, searching for that familiar mental nexus, the sacred space where 8 souls had become one with his own. For a long time, there was nothing. Just the echo of his own frantic thoughts, and the low thrum of danger sense. He almost gave up, convinced that the vestiges had burned out completely in that final, reality-rending attack. But then, a flicker. A spark in the void. He focused on it, nurtured it, poured what little willpower he had into it. The space slowly coalesced around him. It wasn't the bright, clear boardroom of his memories. This was a gray, misty non-place, like being inside a storm cloud. The air was thick with static, and the figures that began to resolve before him were not solid. They were translucent, flickering like dying holograms, their forms wavering in and out of existence. The first to speak was Nana Shimura. She stood closest to him, her ethereal form shimmering, her kind face etched with a sorrow that mirrored his own. Her voice was faint, distorted, like a message carried across a vast distance. Zuko, can you hear us? I can hear you, he whispered, his own voice hoarse. You're all still here. What's left of us? A gruff voice crackled from the gloom. The second user, his form barely more than a silhouette with sharp, angry edges, stood with his arms crossed. That final gambit, it cost nearly everything. We are echoes. We held on to pull you back. The third user added, his voice a low rumble. Kept your heart beating. Stitched you back together, atom by atom. There was nothing left for the world outside. The admission hung in the gray space, confirming his worst fears. They had saved him, and only him. Nana's form drifted closer, her spectral hand reaching out but passing through his shoulder. The gesture was still comforting. We felt your grief, little one. It is a weight we all share, to lose everything you fought for. Her voice hitched, the static crackling around her words. She knew this pain. She had lost her own family, her own son, to the crusade against All for One. The silence that followed was filled with a shared, ancient sorrow. I failed, Izuku said, the words tasting like ash. I won the fight, but I failed. All Might. I failed his final wish. I'm alive, but for what? To preside over a graveyard? A new presence, a faint warmth, began to emanate from the center of the misty room. It was not a voice, not yet, but a feeling. The feeling of a proud smile, of unwavering hope. All Might. Survival is the first step, ninth. The second user's voice cut through the quiet. It was sharp, pragmatic. Grief is a luxury. That hum you feel? Your danger sense? It hasn't been active because there's been nothing alive within its range. Until now. That is not an invitation. It is a threat. He's right. The third rumbled. This isn't our world anymore. The rules are gone. You are a resource. You are healthy. You have power. To anyone else out there, you are a target. You must think of survival first. Survival? Izuku looked down at his trembling hands. Just hiding in this hole for the rest of my life? What kind of life is that, Izuku? Nana's voice was gentle, a soothing balm on his frayed nerves. They are right that you must be careful. But survival alone is not living. You carry more than just yourself. You carry the memory of us, the memory of everyone you fought for. And then, All Might's voice finally broke through the static. It wasn't the booming baritone of the symbol of peace, but the quiet, reedy tone of Tashinori Yagi, fragile but filled with an unshakable conviction. It was faint, like a distant radio signal, but it was clear. My boy, you did not fail. Izuku's head snapped up. The ghostly form of All Might was the least distinct of all, little more than a shimmering golden outline, a human-shaped star. A hero's duty is to protect the people, their smiles. The voice crackled. That world, the one we knew, it couldn't be saved. Not from that much hate. But you ended the cycle. You defeated All for One for good. You gave the future a chance, even if the present was lost. But there is no future. Izuku protested, his voice cracking. There's nothing left. You are left. All Might's echo stated simply. And that hum, your danger sense. Don't you see? It is the sound of a world that is not entirely dead. It is a question mark. You are right to be cautious, but you cannot let fear be your only guide. The idea of a hero, a symbol, it doesn't need a parade, Izuku. It just needs one person. One person willing to help another. That is where it begins again. Don't give up on the idea. The second user scoffed, a burst of static. Ideas don't fill your stomach. They don't patch your wounds. No. All Might's warm echo replied, his light flaring faintly. But they are what make a full stomach and a healed wound worth having. Be smart, Izuku. Survive. But do not forget why you are surviving. The misty space began to dissolve, the voices fading back into distorted whispers. The last thing he felt was the faint warmth of All Might's presence, and his final, crackling words. Be a hero, Izuku. Find out what that means now. Izuku opened his eyes. He was back in the silent, dusty infirmary. The vestiges were gone, their counsel leaving him with a maelstrom of conflicting directives: hide, survive, investigate, hope. But they had given him a purpose, however small. The second and third were right. He couldn't help anyone if he was dead. He couldn't be a symbol if he starved. His new purpose, for now, was simple and brutal: survival. He had to regain his strength. He had to understand this new world. And he had to find the source of that hum. His first priority was a methodical inventory of the bunker. The place was a marvel of engineering, a self-contained ark designed to withstand the apocalypse. It had its own air filtration system, which seemed to be passively working, and a deep-level geothermal power source that had, at some point, failed. But the emergency supplies were untouched. In a cavernous storage bay, he found what he was looking for. Crates upon crates of military-grade MREs, meals ready to eat, and more importantly, shelf-stable nutrient paste. The labels claimed a single tube contained all the necessary calories and vitamins for a full day. He also found a water reclamation system that had failed, but its primary reservoir still held thousands of gallons of purified water, flat and tasteless but life-sustaining. Life became a routine, a monastic existence in the tomb of heroism. Each day was a cycle. He would wake, consume a tube of the bland, gritty paste, and drink his ration of water. Then, he would work. His first project was his own body. He began a gentle training regimen, starting with simple stretches and bodyweight exercises. Push-ups, sit-ups, squats. At first, he could barely manage a few before collapsing, his body shaking with exhaustion. But with the grim determination that had been forged in him since childhood, he persisted. Day by day, he felt the strength slowly, painstakingly seeping back into his limbs. His second project was the bunker itself. He became its caretaker, its sole inhabitant. He cleared debris from corridors, reinforced crumbling sections of wall, and organized the supplies. It was mindless, physical labor, and it kept the ghosts at bay. During this work, he began to refamiliarize himself with his quirks, not as weapons, but as tools. He found a section of the ceiling in a secondary generator room that was beginning to sag under the immense weight of the rock above. Instead of a support beam, he used black-whip. He manifested several thick, dark tendrils, weaving them into a load-bearing lattice that adhered to the ceiling and walls, securing the structure with a quiet hum of energy. It was strange, using the power meant to bind villains to instead hold his home together. He started a map of the immediate area around UA, a project that required regular, cautious scouting trips. For this, he used float. He would rise just high enough to see over the nearby ruins, his movements careful and controlled. He never went too high, never made himself an obvious target against the orange sky. He'd hover for a few minutes, committing the twisted, alien landscape to memory, before descending back into the safety of a ruined building. The world was a vast, static ruin, and the low hum of danger sense was its constant, unnerving soundtrack. His most ambitious project, however, involved F.A. Gene. The bunker was a treasure trove of pre-apocalypse technology, all of it dead. He found a small, portable communications rig, a short-wave radio with a hand-crank charger. The crank was broken. Frustration gnawed at him. Information was life, and this machine was a potential lifeline. He spent days studying its schematics, which he found in a water-damaged technical manual. He took the device apart, his analytical mind, once used to dissecting hero and villain quirks, now focused on circuits and power converters. He couldn't fix the crank mechanism, but he had an idea. An insane, desperate, Midori-esque idea. F.A. Gene stored kinetic energy. What if he could discharge that energy in a controlled way? He took the dynamo from the hand crank, a small coil and magnet assembly, and jury-rigged it to a pair of insulated cables. His first attempts were failures. He'd release the stored energy, and a wild arc of electricity would short out the connection or send the dynamo spinning so fast it nearly flew apart. It was too much, too uncontrolled. He needed to be more precise. He spent an entire day just walking back and forth in a long corridor, a human battery charging himself up. He focused, picturing the energy not as a flood, but as a gentle, consistent pressure. He touched the cables to the dynamo's contacts, and released the stored kinetic energy from his footsteps, not as a smash, but as a steady, controlled push. A low whine came from the dynamo. The small charging light on the radio flickered. Once, twice, and then it stayed on. A weak but steady red glow. A grin, the first genuine smile in what felt like an eternity, split his face. It was working. He could generate power. It was a minuscule amount, but it was something. It was a victory of mind over circumstance, a tiny spark of the old world rekindled by his own body. Weeks bled into months. His gaunt frame filled out, the hollows in his cheeks softening. Muscle, hard and lean, returned to his arms and legs. The beard he had woken up with was now trimmed and neat, a practical decision. He was no longer a ghost. He was a survivor. A solitary man living at the end of the world. Throughout it all, the hum persisted. A constant companion. He learned to live with it, to use it as a baseline. Any fluctuation, any change in its intensity, would be a sign. One day, the change came. He was on a scouting run, floating 50 feet above the ground, mapping a new quadrant of ruins to the east. He felt the hum, which had been a uniform pressure from all directions, suddenly intensify from a single point. It sharpened, the frequency rising slightly, east. Towards the city center. The second user's voice echoed in his memory. That is not an invitation. It is a threat, but All Might's voice echoed too. Find out what that means now. He had prepared for this. He was stronger. He was smarter. He could not stay in the bunker forever. Clad in a patched-up, nondescript set of dark fatigues he'd found in storage, a hood pulled up to obscure his distinctive hair, he set out, following the insistent pull of his danger sense. The journey was a tense, nerve-wracking affair. He moved through the canyons of collapsed buildings, sticking to the shadows. He finally reached his destination, a skeletal communications tower that speared the orange sky, one of the few structures still mostly intact. The hum was strongest here, a palpable thrum against his skull. He smelled it before he saw it, wood smoke. Faint, but unmistakable. He dropped to a crouch behind a mountain of debris, his heart hammering against his ribs. He crept forward, peering through a gap in a rusted metal plate. Below, nestled in the lee of the tower's massive base, was a camp. A small community of perhaps 24 people huddled around a pathetic fire built from shattered furniture. They were gaunt, their faces smudged with grime, their clothes little more than layered rags. They looked like the dregs of humanity, beaten down but stubbornly, fiercely alive. Makeshift tents of tarpaulin and scrap metal dotted the small clearing. Armed guards with crude spears and scavenged pipes stood watch at the perimeter. These were the first people he had seen. The source of the hum. And they looked terrified. He watched them for a long time, his analytical mind kicking into overdrive. Their social structure was clear. There were lookouts, laborers, and what looked like a leader, a woman with short, dark hair who directed the others with sharp, efficient gestures. They were a unit, honed by hardship. He couldn't just leave. He had to know more. He had to make contact. He retreated, circled around the camp, and approached from a different, more open direction, wanting to be seen from a distance. He carried nothing but a small pack containing a few sealed packs of purified water and 2 tubes of nutrient paste. A peace offering. He was still 100 yards out when one of the lookouts spotted him. A harsh cry went up. In an instant, the camp was on high alert. Spears were leveled. People scrambled into their tents. They moved with the panicked efficiency of prey that had been hunted many times before. Izuku stopped, raising his hands slowly to show they were empty. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding strange and loud in the quiet air. "I'm not here to hurt you." Several of the tougher-looking scavengers advanced on him, their makeshift weapons held ready. The woman with the short hair moved to the front, her eyes, dark and piercing, narrowing as she took him in. "That's close enough," she snapped, her voice raspy but firm. Izuku stopped. He could see them clearly now. He saw the hunger in their faces, but beneath it, he saw a profound, deep-seated suspicion. They weren't looking at him. They were assessing him. And what they saw, they didn't like. He was clean. He was well-fed. His clothes, though simple, were intact. In a world where every calorie was a battle, his relative health was an accusation. "My name is Izuku," he said, keeping his voice calm and even. "I saw your tower. I've been alone for a long time. I was just hoping to find others. The woman took another step forward. She had a strange, intense focus in her eyes as she scanned him from head to toe. Where did you come from? You're not from any of the local warrens. I had a shelter, he said, sticking to a half-truth. Underground. The supplies lasted a long time. One of the men beside her, a burly man with a scarred face, spat on the ground. A shelter boy. Comes waltzing in here when his pantry runs dry. What do you want from us? Nothing, Izuku said, slowly lowering his pack to the ground and opening it. He took out a water pack. I wanted to offer you this. A trade for information, maybe. The sight of the clean, sealed water pack sent a ripple through the group. Their eyes, which had been hostile, now glinted with a desperate thirst. But the leader's gaze remained like flint. Nobody gives anything for free, she said, her eyes flicking from the water to his face. What's the price? Just talk, Izuku pleaded. What happened? How many are left? The woman was silent for a long moment. Her eyes narrowed further, and Izuku felt a strange sensation, like a faint magnetic pull, run over his body. It was her quirk. She was scanning him. He had no metal on him, but the act itself was unnerving. Finally, she gestured with her chin. Leave the water. And the food. Then you can ask your questions. From a distance, Izuku did as he was told, pushing the small pack forward with his foot. The scarred man darted forward, snatched it, and scurried back like a frightened animal. The woman, Elara, as he would learn she was called, never took her eyes off him. You're strong, she stated, not a question but a fact. You move easy. Not like someone who's been starving. That makes you dangerous. Strength doesn't have to be a danger, Izuku replied carefully. Elara let out a short, harsh laugh devoid of any humor. Kid, look around. Strength is the only thing that's dangerous. Strength is what cracked the sky. Strength is what burned the cities. Men with power like gods tore the world apart fighting over who got to be the biggest monster. We're what's left. We don't have time for strong men or their good intentions. We just want to see the next sunrise. Her words were a physical blow, a perfect articulation of the ruin that surrounded them. The age of heroes and villains had ended, and the survivors hated them both equally. I'm not like them, Izuku said quietly. We'll see, Elara said, her expression unreadable. She seemed to come to a decision. You want to know what's out there? It's dust, and ruin, and things you're better off not meeting. Most people are gone. The few that are left are scattered. Small groups like us, hiding in the cracks. Are there any bigger settlements? Places that are rebuilding? He asked, a sliver of hope in his voice. Elara's expression soured. You mean like the old world? Walls, rules, all that nonsense? There's one place, maybe. A rumor. A fortified town to the west, built out of an old market city. They call it Haven. Supposedly they have walls, farms, even power. Haven. The name itself sounded like a prayer. But, Elara continued, her voice dropping to a low, serious tone as she took a step closer. Don't go there thinking you'll be welcome. Especially not you. Why me? I told you. You're strong. I can feel it. It's in the way you stand. The way you breathe. Haven has one rule above all others. They don't like power. They blame people with powerful quirks for everything. They'll see you as a threat. As a ghost of the past that's best left buried. She paused, looking over his shoulder as if seeing something in the desolate landscape behind him. Her voice became a near whisper. And there are worse things in the wastes than scavengers like us. There are those who still worship the power that broke the world. Fanatics. They call themselves the disciples of decay. They roam in convoys, flying a banner of a rotting hand. They don't just take your supplies. They preach a gospel of destruction. They believe the one who ended it all was a savior, and that anyone trying to rebuild is a heretic. Disciples of decay. A cult built around the memory of Tamura Shigaraki. The thought sent a chill down Izuku's spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. Elara straightened up, her brief moment of counsel over. So there's your information, shelter boy. A town that fears you and a death cult that will hunt you. Now take your leave. You've drawn enough attention for one day. Don't come back. She turned her back on him and walked back toward the fire, leaving Izuku standing alone in the encroaching twilight. He was alone again, but the world was no longer silent. It now had a name for its hope, Haven, and a name for its madness, the Disciples. He had a destination, a warning, and the unshakable feeling that he was walking out of one graveyard and into the heart of a war he never knew had begun. Elara's warning echoed in Izuku's mind as he walked away from the communications tower, a bitter counterpoint to the thrum of his own danger sense. A town that fears you and a death cult that will hunt you. It was a grim map of the new world, a choice between being feared and being hunted. Yet, within that bleak assessment lay a single, luminous word: Haven. It was more than a destination. It was a hypothesis. It was the possibility that some semblance of society, of community, had survived. It was a test of All Might's final, fading counsel: don't give up on the idea. Izuku couldn't. To stay in his bunker was to be a monument to the past. To seek out Haven, however dangerous, was to take the first step into the future. He set his course west, using the pale, hazy disk of the sun as his guide. The journey was a brutal education in the planet's new hostility. The world that had been unmade by overwhelming quirk energy had not been left a sterile void. It had been reseeded with a strange and terrible new life. The first few days were a lesson in endurance. The ground was a treacherous thing, a mosaic of shattered asphalt, fields of powdered glass that crunched under his boots, and vast stretches of the crimson, fleshy moss that seemed to suck the moisture from the air. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace, conserving the energy he so painstakingly regained. His body was a machine he was still learning to operate, and he knew its fuel was finite. He saw the new ecosystem firsthand. On the second day, while scavenging in the shell of a department store, he was stalked by a pack of what he mentally dubbed rubble skulkers. They were canids of some kind, perhaps descended from stray dogs, but their forms were warped. Their fur was patchy and mangy, their skin the color of dried blood, and their front legs were overly long and powerful, built for digging through debris. Their eyes glowed with the same sickly green bioluminescence he'd seen in the vines around Yue. They weren't overtly aggressive, but they followed him for miles, a silent, patient pack of scavengers waiting for him to fall. He finally lost them by using Black Whip, not as a weapon, but to ascend the sheer face of a collapsed office building they couldn't climb, a silent, vertical escape into the orange haze. The flora was just as dangerous. He learned to identify patches of shrieker spores, small, puffball-like fungi that, when disturbed, would burst with a high-frequency sound that was physically painful, disorienting him and attracting any unwanted attention in the area. He learned to avoid the glass thorn bushes, plants that grew crystalline thorns sharp enough to pierce the thick canvas of his pants. This world demanded a new kind of heroism. Not the heroism of a dynamic, city-saving punch, but the quiet, unseen heroism of survival. He used his quirks with a newfound subtlety and respect. Float became his eyes, a tool for 30-second bursts of aerial reconnaissance to chart a path through the labyrinthine ruins. Black Whip was his hands, extending his reach to secure a crumbling ledge or create a bridge over a chasm of twisted rebar. Fa Gene was his heart, the quiet thrum of stored energy from his long marches, a private reserve he jealously guarded, knowing it might be the only power source he'd have for a long, long time. Danger Sense was his skin, a constant, low-level hum that warned him of the unstable ground, and the unseen things that watched from the shadows. On the 5th day of his journey he saw it. A landmark he recognized with a cold knot of dread in his stomach. In the distance, rising from the plains of rubble like the bones of a great beast, were the distinct peaks of the Gunga mountain range. And nestled at its base, a place of sharp, conflicting memories, were the ruins of the beast's forest, the site of the training camp. He hadn't intended to go there. His route was meant to bypass it to the south. But his feet, moving with a will of their own, began to carry him toward the familiar slopes. It was a pilgrimage he didn't know he needed to make. It was a place where they had laughed and struggled, where he had broken himself to save a child, and where they had first truly felt the shadow of all for one lengthen over their lives. As he drew closer, the air grew still and heavy, thick with the ghosts of the past. The forest that had once been lush and green was now a petrified nightmare. The trees were skeletal, blackened spires of carbon, their branches clawing at the orange sky like wizened fingers. The ground was covered in a thick layer of ashen soil. The facility itself, the main building where the pussycats had greeted them, was a collapsed wreck, its roof caved in, its walls blasted outward. He walked through the silence, his boots leaving deep prints in the ash. This was where he had fought muscular, a battle of raw, desperate power. He could almost feel the phantom pain in his arms, the memory of shattering his own bones over and over. He passed the cliff face, the site of his ordeal, and saw that a huge section of it had sloughed away, leaving a fresh rock scar. He was just moving past the collapsed edge of the main facility, his mind a swirl of painful nostalgia, when his foot caught on something half buried in the ashen dirt. He stumbled, catching himself before he fell. Annoyed, he looked down to see what had tripped him. It was a piece of metal, bent and twisted, its surface dull and corroded. He knelt, curiosity piqued, and began to dig around it with his fingers. The ash was soft and fine. He brushed it away, revealing more of the object. It was a piece of armor, painted a deep blue, though most of the paint had been flaked off by time and heat. As he cleared more of it away, his breath caught in his throat. There, barely visible under the grime and rust, was the stylized, angular letter I. And next to it, the unmistakable shape of a lightning bolt. It was a piece of Ingenium's armor. A pauldron, maybe, or part of a leg brace. It was crushed almost beyond recognition, a piece of scrap metal to anyone else in this dead world. But to Izuku, it was a voice from the grave. He picked it up, the metal cold and heavy in his hand. He could see him so clearly. Tenya Ida, his chopping hand gestures, his rigid adherence to the rules, the fierce, unwavering loyalty that burned behind his glasses. He remembered Ida's frantic, desperate run to get help during the USJ attack. He remembered Ida's dark, vengeful quest in Hosu, and the relief and shame on his face after they had saved him from staying. He remembered Ida's booming voice, always pushing Class 1A to be better, to be faster, to be more heroic. Izuku's throat tightened. He squeezed the piece of armor, the sharp, bent edges digging into his palm. Ida, the class president, the pillar of order and discipline. What would he think of this chaotic, lawless world? He would have had a plan. A multi-stage, color-coded plan for reconstruction, for rationing, for the re-establishment of a functioning society. He wouldn't be wandering alone. He'd be organizing. Leading. A gust of the dry, dusty wind swept across the ruins, stirring the ash at his feet. It uncovered something else, something small and pale that had been hidden under the same pile of debris as the armor piece. It was a small, curved shard of plastic, no bigger than his palm. The color was what stopped his heart. A faded, sun-bleached, but still unmistakable shade of pink. His hand trembled as he reached for it. He picked it up. It was light, brittle, and cracked down the middle. It was one of the rounded cheek guards from a helmet. Uraraka's helmet. If the piece of Ida's armor had been a voice, this was a punch to the soul. It was so small, so mundane, yet so profoundly, intimately her. Achiko Uraraka. The first friend he had made at UA. The person whose kindness had literally saved him from falling on his face on the very first day. The one who gave his hero name, a name once used to mock him, its power. He ran his thumb over the cracked plastic, feeling the faint texture of a deep scratch near the edge. He remembered her bright, determined smile. He remembered her fierce battle against Bakugo and the sports festival, her desperate, last-ditch meteor shower. He remembered her floating, her cheeks flushed with exertion, a joyful grin on her face. He remembered her face streaked with tears as she defended him from the civilian mob, her voice ringing out, clear and true, pleading for them to let their hero rest. Holding the two relics, a piece of his most stalwart friend and a piece of his kindest, Izuku felt the carefully constructed walls around his grief begin to crumble. The weight of their absence, of all their absences, pressed down on him with the force of a mountain. He sank to his knees in the ash, a choked sound escaping his lips, and in the silence of the dead forest, his mind, triggered by the ghost of a friend's smile, cast him back. Back through the years of pain and ruin, to a time before the end, to a quiet moment of peace before the final storm. The sky over Muzurufu was a tapestry of deep purple and glittering gold. The city lights spread out below them like a fallen constellation. It was late. The air was cool on the rooftop of the 1A dorms, a welcome relief after a grueling day of joint training with the upperclassmen. The final war was no longer a distant possibility. It was a certainty, a storm gathering on the horizon, and every moment of training was filled with a desperate, unspoken urgency. They sat in a small, tired circle. Ida was ramrod straight as always, but the exhaustion was plain in the slump of his shoulders. Uraraka was leaning back on her hands, her face tilted up towards the first stars pricking the twilight sky. Izuku sat between them, nursing a bottle of water, the familiar ache of one for all thrumming in his limbs. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sounds were the distant hum of the city, and the gentle breeze. It was Ida who finally broke the silence, his voice low and serious. "The simulations today were sobering," he stated, adjusting his glasses, a familiar, nervous tic. "The projected collateral damage models from a full-scale confrontation with Shigaraki's forces are catastrophic. Winning the battle is only the first, most violent step. The reconstruction effort will be a feat of heroism on a scale we have never seen." He was already thinking past the fight. He was thinking of logistics, of infrastructure, of displaced populations. That was Ida. Always 10 steps ahead, his mind a fortress of plans and contingencies. "We'll have to be there for that too," Uraraka said softly, her eyes still on the sky. "It's not just about knocking down the bad guys. It's about helping people put the pieces back together afterwards, finding them homes, making sure they have food, making them feel safe again." Her focus, as always, was on the people, the human cost. Izuku nodded, his gaze fixed on the endless sprawl of lights. "It's going to take all of us," he murmured. "Every hero. Every student. Everyone." He felt the familiar weight of his quirk, of All Might's legacy. The weight of being the one who had to stand at the very center of the storm. Uraraka seemed to sense his anxiety. She turned her head, her round, expressive eyes fixing on him. There was a profound seriousness in her gaze that cut through her usual bubbliness. "You know, Deku," she began, her voice quiet but firm. "You're going to be the one they all look to when it's all over. Just like they used to look at All Might." Izuku flinched. I'm not him, Uraraka. "I know," she said, and a small, sad smile touched her lips. "But you're you. And you're the one who always runs in first. You're the one who never, ever gives up. When the dust settles, and everyone is scared and they don't know what to do, they're going to look for a symbol. They're going to look for someone to show them it's okay to hope again." She leaned forward, her expression earnest and pleading. "Winning the fight, that's just part of it. But after? That's maybe even more important. People are going to be so hurt, so broken, they might forget how to smile." She reached out and gently nudged his arm with her fist, a gesture of camaraderie that was so uniquely her. "So you have to promise me something," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, a secret shared between them and the stars. Ida had fallen silent, watching them, understanding the gravity of the moment. "Promise me," Uraraka repeated, her eyes boring into his. "That even if things get really, really bad, even if we lose things we can't get back, you have to be the one to help people smile again, Deku. You have to carry that light for them. For us. Promise?" Izuku looked at her, at the absolute, unwavering faith in her eyes. He looked at Ida, who gave a single, solemn nod of agreement. They weren't just his friends. They were his pillars, the ones who grounded him, the ones who believed in him even when he struggled to believe in himself. He felt the weight of her words settle onto his soul, a burden far heavier than any physical weight he had ever lifted. It was a sacred trust. A ghost of a promise for a future he couldn't yet see. He met her gaze, his own eyes burning with unshed tears, and he nodded. "I promise, Uraraka," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise." The memory shattered, and he was back in the ashen wasteland, on his knees, the cold metal of Ingenium's armor in one hand and the cracked plastic of Uraraka's helmet in the other. The promise. It crashed down upon him with the force of a tidal wave. He hadn't understood it then. He had thought it was about the immediate aftermath of a terrible battle. He had pictured himself pulling people from rubble, helping at triage centers, being a symbol of hope amidst the chaos of rebuilding. He had never, in his wildest nightmares, imagined a world where he was the only one left to even remember the promise. A single, choked sob escaped him. His grief, which had been a dull, crushing weight, was now a sharp, searing fire. But something else was happening, too. The fire wasn't just burning him. It was forging him. You have to be the one to help people smile again, Deku. It wasn't just a memory anymore. It was a directive. It was his mission. His survival was not for his own sake. His journey to Haven was not just a search for safety. It was the fulfillment of his promise. He was carrying their will. Ida's will for order and structure, Uraraka's will for kindness and hope. All Might's will for a symbol that smiles in the face of despair. He was their living legacy. Slowly, reverently he stood up. The sky was still a bruised orange. The world was still a corpse. But his place in it had just become terrifyingly, devastatingly clear. He was no longer just a survivor, a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. He was a keeper of the flame. With painstaking care, he tore a strip of cloth from the inside of his pack and wrapped the two relics, creating a small, soft bundle. He placed it in the most protected pocket of his pack, where it rested against his back, a constant, physical reminder of the weight he now carried. He turned his back on the ruins of the beast's forest and faced west once more. His grief had not vanished. It was a part of him now, a cold, hard stone in his gut. But it no longer paralyzed him. It was a whetstone, and it had just sharpened his resolve into a razor's edge. He walked for the rest of the day, his pace faster, his stride more certain. The mutated creatures and treacherous terrain were no longer just obstacles to be survived. They were trials to be overcome. Each step was a defiance of the silence. Each breath was a protest against the decay. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, turning the orange to a deep, bruised purple, he sought high ground to make a cold camp for the night. He found a collapsed highway overpass, a concrete behemoth that offered a commanding view of the desolate valley below. He settled down behind a concrete barrier, chewing on a piece of tasteless nutrient jerky, his eyes scanning the horizon. The silence was profound, as always, and then he heard it. It started as a low, deep rumble, a vibration he felt in the soles of his boots more than he heard with his ears. It grew steadily, resolving itself into the unmistakable sound of multiple combustion engines, ragged and poorly tuned, but powerful. Izuku was on his feet in an instant, his heart leaping into his throat. He crept to the edge of the broken overpass, peering down into the valley. In the distance, a procession of dim, flickering lights was moving through the twilight. A convoy. It was a bizarre collection of vehicles cobbled together from the wrecks of the old world. A massive dump truck with sheets of scrap metal welded to its sides served as the lead, followed by modified buses with barred windows and smaller, faster dune buggy-like vehicles darting around the flanks. But it was the banner on the lead truck that made his blood run cold. Even from this distance, he could see it clearly. A huge, tattered black flag, whipped by the wind. On it, crudely painted in what looked like white or faded gray, was a chillingly familiar symbol. A skeletal hand, its 5 fingers outstretched. The symbol of decay. The symbol of Shigaraki. Elara's final warning came rushing back. The disciples of decay. They were real. And they were here. The theoretical threat was now a rumbling, gas-belching reality, crawling across the skin of his broken world like a vile infection. The promise in his heart warred with the primal fear in his gut. He was the last hero, standing on a broken bridge at the end of the world, watching a procession of monsters roll by under the flag of the man who had destroyed it all. The convoy was a wound on the landscape. It carved a scar of dust and noise through the profound silence, a procession of jagged, ugly shapes crawling under the dying light. From his perch on the broken overpass, Izuku felt a cold dread crystallize in his stomach. This was the antithesis of everything he had just promised to uphold. This was not the spark of society he sought. This was the festering ghost of its destruction, given wheels and an engine. He instinctively flattened himself against the concrete barrier, his profile low, his breathing shallow. He was a shepherd who had just caught sight of the wolves. His first instinct, honed by months of solitary survival, was to hide. To let them pass. To be a ghost and allow these other, louder ghosts to continue on their way. He was one man. They were an army, but the promise he had just renewed in the ashes of the beast's forest was a stubborn, burning thing. He couldn't just let them go. He had to know what they were. He had to understand the nature of this new evil. Knowledge was a weapon, perhaps the only one he could afford to use right now. He activated float, but not to fly. He used a bare whisper of its power, just enough to lighten his own weight, allowing him to move with an unnatural silence. He became a shadow, flitting from one piece of cover to the next, paralleling the convoy's path along the ridge of the valley. He was downwind, the ragged roar of their engines covering any small sound he might make. As he got closer, the details of the convoy came into sharp, horrifying focus. The vehicles were monstrosities of scrapyard engineering. Spikes and sharpened rebar protruded from their chassis like angry spines. Tattered effigies, made from rags and bones and meant to resemble a figure with shaggy white hair, were mounted on their hoods. The people themselves were no less intimidating. They were clad in leather and scavenged metal, their faces often obscured by gas masks, goggles, or crude, hand-painted masks that mimicked a skeletal grin. He crept closer still, finding a vantage point behind the rusted-out shell of a tanker truck that had crashed on the valley's slope years ago. From here, he could not only see them, he could hear them. Their engines idled as the convoy ground to a halt in a wide, flat basin littered with the skeletons of burned-out cars. And then, he heard the doctrine. A figure climbed onto the roof of the lead dump truck. He was tall and gaunt, wrapped in layers of decaying fabric, but it was the helmet he wore that seized Izuku's attention. It was a distorted, almost ceremonial replica of Shigaraki's father, hand, the 5 fingers clasping his entire head, with crude eye slits cut into the palm. From a speaker system welded to the truck's roof, his voice, amplified and distorted, boomed across the basin. "Brothers and sisters of the unburdening," the voice rasped, filled with a chilling, fanatical fervor. "We rest here tonight, in another graveyard of the false age. Look around you. See the lies of the heroes laid bare. They promised safety. They promised order. And what did they deliver? This." A tomb, a ragged cheer went up from the assembled crowd. They were a cargo cult, Izuku realized with a sickening lurch. A cargo cult built around the memory of a mass murderer. The liberator, the great decayer, he saw the truth. The man in the hand helmet preached. He knew that society was a cage. That quirks were a curse that bound us to vanity and conflict. He came not to destroy the world, but to free it. To unburden it from the weight of its own pathetic hopes. He offered us the gift of true equality, the equality of dust. Izuku felt a wave of nausea. They had twisted Shigaraki's nihilistic rage into a gospel. They saw this wasteland not as a tragedy, but as a paradise of their God's making. But even now, the preacher continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl, there are those who cling to the old ways. Termites, trying to rebuild their rotten nest. They hide behind walls, they hoard resources, they whisper the names of the false symbols. They try to chain the world again. We, the disciples of decay, are His will made manifest. We are the instruments of His final, perfect entropy. We will find these nests of hope, and we will liberate them. Another cheer, this one more savage. It was the sound of broken people who had found a new, more terrible thing to believe in. Izuku understood now. They weren't just scavengers. They were crusaders. Their mission was to stamp out the very embers of civilization he was so desperately trying to find. As the preacher's sermon ended, the disciples began to set up their camp. They moved with a practiced, brutal efficiency, but his attention was drawn to a smaller, secondary drama unfolding at the edge of the basin. A small, ramshackle shelter, almost perfectly camouflaged amongst the junk, had been discovered by one of the Outrider buggies. It looked like little more than a lean-to built against a concrete slab, home to a small family, a man, a woman, and a young girl who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. They were survivors, like Alara's group, but even more desperate, their faces hollowed out by starvation. The disciples descended upon them not like a conquering army, but like a pack of hyenas. They tore the lean-to apart, laughing as the family's meager possessions, a few cans of food, a pot, a threadbare blanket, were scattered. The father, a scrawny man with more courage than sense, tried to stand in their way, holding up a rusted pipe. "Please!" he begged, his voice thin and cracking. "That's all we have." The leader of the raiding party, a brutish woman with a jagged scar across her face, just laughed. "Possessions are a burden. The Liberator freed you from them. Be grateful." She backhanded the man with contemptuous ease, sending him sprawling into the dirt. Izuku's muscles coiled. Every instinct, every fiber of his being, screamed at him to intervene. The image of the terrified little girl, clutching her mother's leg, her wide eyes reflecting the firelight of the disciples' camp, was a physical blow. This was it. This was the moment. The reason he was still here. Grief is a luxury. The second user's voice, cold and pragmatic, echoed in his mind. Revealing yourself makes you a target for everyone. They are many. You are one. Observe. Survive. But then, another voice, warmer and more urgent, rose to counter it. Nana Shimura's. Look at that little girl, Izuku. Is this the world you survived for? Where the strong prey on the weak and call it salvation. What is a hero, if not a shield for those who have none? And finally, All Might's quiet, resolute echo. A symbol doesn't need a parade, my boy. It just needs one person willing to help another. He was conflicted. The second user was right. A direct confrontation was tactical suicide. He was strong, but he was untested after so many years. His body was a newly repaired engine he hadn't yet pushed to its limits. He didn't know the full extent of the disciples' strength, their numbers, their quirks. If he revealed his power here, he'd have the entire cult hunting him all the way to Haven. He would become a beacon, and as Ilara had warned, his light would attract trouble. But Nana was right too. He looked at the scene again. The disciples were now trying to drag the man and woman away, presumably to forcibly conscript them into their roving flock of madmen. The little girl was screaming, a high, thin sound of pure terror that cut through the noise of the camp. That sound severed the last threads of his hesitation. He could not stand by. He could not be a ghost while this was happening. A hero wasn't a hero only when it was safe. He was a hero when it was necessary. He wouldn't be reckless. He wouldn't announce himself with a 100% smash. He would be smart. Surgical. A whisper of the old world, not a roar. He took a deep breath, the dry, dusty air filling his lungs. He let a controlled flow of 1 for all, 15%, suffuse his body. The familiar, crackling green energy enveloped him, a sight no one in this world had seen for years. It felt like coming home. The power hummed in his veins. A sleeping giant finally stirred. He slipped down the embankment, his float-assisted movements making him preternaturally silent. He landed behind a pile of wrecked cars just 30 yards from the confrontation. The scarred woman was laughing as the father struggled against her grip. "Stop fighting your liberation! You'll thank us when you've been unburdened. Let my family go!" The man choked out, his face pale with terror. "Your family is a chain," the woman sneered. "Today we break it." "I don't think so," a quiet voice said. Every head snapped in the direction of the sound. Izuku stepped out from behind the wreckage. He had his hood down, his face unmasked, the green lightning of 1 for all dancing across his skin and illuminating the determined set of his jaw. For a moment, there was just stunned silence. The disciples stared at him, their brains struggling to process what they were seeing. He was clean. He was healthy. And he was glowing with a power that screamed of the old world, of the very thing they were taught to despise. He was a myth made flesh. A ghost from a dead world. The scarred woman was the first to recover. Her sneer returned, mixed with a sort of fascinated disgust. "Well, look what we have here. A glowworm. A relic. Did you get lost on your way to the museum, hero?" Izuku ignored her, his eyes fixed on the family. "Let them go," he said, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of steel that surprised even himself. "Or what?" the woman challenged, shoving the father forward. "You'll stop us? You and what army?" Izuku took another step forward. "Just me." That was all the invitation she needed. With a roar, 2 of the disciples charged him, brandishing crude weapons, one with a sharpened pipe, the other with a heavy wrench. Izuku's movements were not the flashy, sometimes reckless acrobatics of his youth. This was different. This was the result of years of mental simulation in his coma, of the vestiges combat experience seeping into his very marrow. It was pure, brutal efficiency. The first attacker swung the pipe at his head. Izuku didn't even bother with a full dodge. He shifted his weight, letting the pipe whistle past his ear, and in the same fluid motion, his hand shot out, not in a fist, but with his fingers stiffened. A precise tap, a finger flick, barely powered by 5%, to the man's wrist. There was a sharp crack. The man screamed and dropped the pipe, his hand dangling at an unnatural angle. He hadn't broken the bone, just dislocated it. Incapacitated, not maimed, the second attacker, seeing his partner fall, hesitated for a split second. It was all the time Izuku needed. He used a burst of speed, closing the distance in a blink. Before the man could bring the wrench to bear, Izuku dropped low, sweeping the man's legs out from under him. As he fell, Izuku manifested a single strand of black whip, using it not to bind, but to snatch the wrench from the man's hand and send it flying into the darkness. The man hit the ground with a grunt, the wind knocked out of him. 2 down in less than 3 seconds. No wasted motion. The rest of the disciples, who had been watching with amusement, were now on their feet, their expressions a mixture of shock and fury. The family had used the distraction to scramble away, hiding behind Izuku's form. The scarred woman's face was a mask of disbelief. What was that? A warning, Izuku said, his green aura flaring slightly brighter. This ends now. Leave them. Leave this place. The woman's shock hardened into rage. A warning? You dare to warn us? We are the will of the Liberator. You are a ghost, a sick echo of a failed age. We will tear you apart. She slammed her fists together, and a strange, shimmering energy, like heat haze, began to radiate from her skin. A quirk. Izuku's mind, the analytical engine that had picked apart hundreds of quirks, instantly kicked into gear. Energy emission? Heat-based? Contact-based? The woman let out a roar and charged. But instead of attacking him directly, she slammed her palm into the chassis of a nearby burnout bus. The metal where she touched it began to glow cherry red. With a heave, she tore a huge, jagged plate of superheated metal from the bus's frame and hurled it at him like a discus. It was a crude but effective attack. Izuku didn't try to block it. He jumped, using a small, controlled burst from his legs to launch himself over the spinning projectile. As he flew over the woman's head, he shot out a strand of black whip. It wasn't aimed at her, but at a tall, rusted light pole a few yards behind her. The whip anchored itself. Izuku swung his body in a tight arc, using the momentum to swing back around. He was coming in fast, feet first. The scarred woman, surprised by his maneuver, turned to meet him, her hands glowing with heat. She was expecting a kick. She wasn't expecting air force. Just before impact, Izuku flexed his feet and ankles, releasing a controlled, compressed blast of air, a 15% St. Louis smash air force. It wasn't a destructive cannonball of force. It was a focused, concussive wave, like a giant invisible hand. The blast struck the woman square in the chest. It didn't break her bones or tear her flesh, but it hit her with the force of a charging bull. She was lifted from her feet, flying backwards 10 yards before crashing into a pile of junk, her heat-generating quirks sputtering out as the wind was knocked from her lungs. The remaining dozen disciples stared, weapons held hesitantly, at their defeated leader. They looked from her groaning form to the figure standing calmly in the center of the clearing, crackling with green energy. They were fanatics, but they were not stupid. They had just witnessed something they didn't understand. A power that was both overwhelming and restrained. It wasn't the chaotic, destructive force of their liberator. It was controlled, precise, and terrifyingly purposeful. He hadn't killed anyone. He hadn't even seemed to try. This calculated mercy was, in its own way, more intimidating than raw power. Who are you? One of them stammered, taking a step back. Izuku let the green aura of one for all recede, the light fading back into his skin until he was just a man standing in the firelight. I'm the one who's telling you to leave, he said, his voice quiet but carrying across the basin. From the main camp, shouts were rising. The commotion had finally drawn the attention of the man in the hand helmet. He was bellowing orders, and the distant rumble of engines starting up told Izuku his window of anonymity was closing fast. He turned to the terrified family huddled behind him. "Go," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Get as far away from here as you can. Head west. There are others. Find them." The father, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror, could only nod dumbly. He grabbed his wife and daughter by the hand, and they fled into the darkness, not looking back. Izuku watched them go, a small, painful pang in his chest. He had saved them. He had kept his promise, if only for 3 people. But the cost was about to come due. The roar of an engine grew loud behind him. One of the dune buggies from the main camp came screaming into the clearing, its headlights pinning him in their glare. The man in the hand helmet was in the passenger seat, and as the buggy skidded to a halt, he rose, his distorted voice booming from a personal speaker on his chest. "There! That's him! The heretic!" The leader, the voice of the liberator, as his followers called him, pointed a finger at Izuku. His other hand rested on the dashboard, and Izuku's danger sense, which had been a low hum, suddenly spiked with a specific, targeted threat. "So," the voice rasped, his head tilting within its grotesque helmet. "A hero fetishist. A relic. I thought your kind was extinct." "Ideals don't go extinct." Izuku shot back, his body tensing, readying for another fight. The voice let out a dry, rattling laugh. "Ideals are a disease. Hope is a poison. The Liberator scoured this world clean, and you are a stain. An anathema. A relic of the old world that must be purged before you can infect others with your sickness." He gave a sharp, curt order to the disciples still standing. "He is one man. Take him. His head will be a trophy on our march to Haven." But the disciples who had witnessed Izuku fight hesitated, their fear overriding their fanaticism. The voice growled in frustration. "Fools! I will do it myself." His quirk was a terrifying thing. He slammed his hand down on the buggy's engine block. A black, viscous energy, like tar, flowed from his palm, covering the engine. The engine screamed, its roar intensifying, and then it exploded in a shower of shrapnel. Izuku threw himself to the side, a piece of the engine block whistling past where his head had been. He realized with a jolt of horror what the man's quirk was. It was a debased, twisted echo of All for One itself. Not the ability to steal quirks, but perhaps to absorb and violently overload energy systems, a scavenger's version of the ultimate power. The voice stood amidst the flaming wreckage of the buggy, completely unharmed, the black energy receding back into his hand. He looked at the disciples who had just retreated from the blast, and then at Izuku. "Run, little hero!" the voice taunted. "Run and tell whatever rats are hiding in this wasteland that the disciples are coming. We will cleanse this world of your memory. This, I swear, in the name of decay." He made no move to pursue. It was a declaration of war. He was letting Izuku go, not out of mercy, but to let him carry the message of their coming. He wanted to spread fear. Izuku stood his ground for a moment longer, his fists clenched. He wanted to end this here. To fight this man, this perversion of everything he stood against. But he knew, with a cold certainty, that it would be a mistake. The rest of the convoy was mobilizing. A fight against the voice would be a protracted, brutal battle, one that would leave him exposed to the entire army. He had saved the family. He had made his stand. Now, he had to be smart. With a final, hard glare at the man in the hand helmet, Izuku turned and ran. He didn't flee blindly. He ran towards the rocky cliffs bordering the valley, his objective clear. He needed to disappear. Behind him, the voice of the Liberator's amplified laughter echoed through the basin, a sound of pure, triumphant malice. Izuku had won the skirmish, but he had just made a powerful, implacable enemy, and revealed himself as a ghost of the old world. A ghost they now had every intention of busting. The laughter of the voice of the Liberator pursued him long after the sounds of the convoy faded into the distance. It was a phantom, a venomous echo that spurred him onward through the desolate night. For 2 days, Izuku pushed himself relentlessly, his pace bordering on a forced march. He slept in short, fitful bursts, his dreams haunted by a skeletal hand and the amplified rasp of a madman's gospel. The encounter with the disciples had stripped away any lingering naivete about the state of the world. He was no longer just a survivor seeking community. He was a messenger carrying a dire warning, a Paul Revere at the end of the world. His path was a straight line west, a desperate race against the presumed advance of the cult. The landscape grew subtly flatter, the jagged skeletons of skyscrapers giving way to the sprawling, low-rise corpses of suburban districts and commercial parks. He crossed dried-up riverbeds choked with rust-colored algae and traversed vast, empty parking lots that stretched for miles, their asphalt cracked and overrun with the same strange, alien flora. On the third morning after the confrontation, he saw it. He was standing on the roof of a collapsed multi-story car park, the sunrise a weak, watercolor wash of orange behind him. In the distance, rising from the haze, was something that didn't belong in this world of ruin. It wasn't a jagged skeleton of a building or a natural rock formation. It was a solid, unbroken line against the horizon. A wall. Hope, a feeling so foreign and tentative it felt like a fragile glass bird in his chest, began to beat its wings. Haven. It took him another half-day to reach it. As he drew closer, the sheer scale of the settlement became apparent. It had been built, as Alara had said, from the shell of a massive, pre-apocalypse commercial complex. It was a sprawling market city, a single, gargantuan structure that had probably once housed hundreds of stores, a cinema, and a dizzying array of restaurants. Now, its outer walls had been massively reinforced. Gaps between buildings were plugged with sheet metal, concrete, and the chassis of wrecked vehicles, all stacked and welded into a formidable barrier. Walkways made of scaffolding and catwalks crisscrossed between the rooftops, and on them, he could see the tiny, distant figures of lookouts. This was not a desperate camp like Alara's. This was a fortress. A bastion. As he approached the main gate, a colossal, reinforced loading bay door from some long-dead hypermarket, he saw signs of life that made his heart ache with a fierce, protective joy. Outside the walls, in fields irrigated by a complex system of pipes, people were working. They were cultivating rows of strange, hardy-looking vegetables under the orange sky. It was agriculture. It was a conscious, organized effort to tame this broken world, not just survive in it. He saw children. A small group of them were playing a game with a ball made of tied-up rags, their laughter thin but genuine in the quiet air. The sight stopped him in his tracks. For the first time in years, he was seeing a future. He was seeing people who were not just enduring, but living. This was what he had promised to protect. His approach did not go unnoticed. A warning horn, its sound clear and sharp, blared from the watchtower above the gate. The farmers in the field stopped their work, gathering their tools and retreating toward a smaller side entrance with practiced speed. The children were quickly ushered inside by a watchful adult. By the time Izuku was within 100 yards of the gate, the entire area outside the walls was deserted. He was alone again, standing before the gate, an outsider seeking entry. The main gate remained shut, but a smaller, human-sized door cut into it slid open. A woman stepped out, flanked by two guards armed with sophisticated-looking crossbows, their bolts tipped with sharpened rebar. The woman was of average height, with sharp, intelligent features and dark hair cut in a practical, no-nonsense bob. She wore durable work clothes, clean and well-maintained, and a tool belt hung at her hip, its pouches filled not with weapons, but with calipers, a folded ruler, and a small tablet-like device. Her eyes, a cool, penetrating gray, assessed him with an unnerving intensity. This was a mind that missed nothing. This was a woman who built things, and who understood that the first step to building anything was identifying its weaknesses. "That's far enough," she called out, her voice not loud, but carrying with an easy authority. "State your name and your purpose." Izuku stopped, raising his hands in the now familiar gesture of non-aggression. "My name is Izuku. I'm a survivor. I'm seeking shelter." The woman, Anya, as he would come to know her, took a step forward, her guards mirroring her movement. Her eyes scanned him from head to toe, her gaze lingering on the same details that had troubled Alara: his healthy physique, the lack of starvation in his face, the quality of his gear. "A survivor," she repeated, the words clinical and detached. "A rather broad term. What did you survive from?" "A private bunker east of here," he replied, sticking to the partial truth. It felt safer. The full truth was a burden he wasn't yet ready to share, a currency he didn't know how to spend. The last of my supplies ran out. Anya's expression didn't change. A bunker. How convenient. And you just happened to stumble upon us? I was told about this place. By another survivor, Izuku said. She called it Haven. She was mistaken. This is Sector 7G. Haven is a romanticism we don't have time for, Anya stated flatly. She took another step, her eyes narrowing. He recognized the look. It was the same piercing, analytical gaze he himself used when dissecting an opponent's quirk. She was dissecting him. You're strong, she said, echoing Ilara's words with a chilling lack of emotion. Well fed. You're not a farmer. You're not a scavenger. Your hands are calloused, but not from manual labor. They're the hands of a fighter. Izuku instinctively curled his fingers into his palm, hiding the intricate network of old, faint scars that crisscrossed his knuckles and palms. Scars from 1,000 punches, from the recoil of his own power. I've had to defend myself, he said, his voice even. I'm sure you have, Anya replied, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Let's be clear, Izuku. We are a community of engineers, farmers, and technicians. We are builders. The age of fighters, of men with great power, is what left the world in this state. We survived by being smart, not by being strong. Strength is a volatile resource. It attracts the wrong kind of attention. She was testing him, her words a series of probes, searching for a reaction. Izuku met her gaze, his expression carefully neutral. I'm not looking for a fight. I'm looking for a home. Anya was silent for a long, tense moment. The wind whistled through the gaps in the reinforced wall, the only sound besides their breathing. She was weighing the risk versus the potential reward. A healthy, capable man was another pair of hands. But a healthy, capable man with secrets was a threat. Finally, she seemed to come to a decision. We have a probationary period for all new arrivals. You'll be given food and shelter. In return, you will work. You will follow our laws. And you will be watched. Is that understood? Yes, Izuku said, relief washing over him, so potent it almost made him dizzy. Good, Anya said, her tone softening almost imperceptibly. There is one law above all others here. It is the foundation of our stability. We call it the power accords. The open use of destabilizing or destructive quirks is forbidden within these walls. Minor, passive, or constructive quirks are tolerated, but anything that can be used as a weapon is to be kept dormant. Power is what broke the world. Here, we build it with our hands. Is that also understood? Izuku's heart skipped a beat. A law against using his quirk. A law against being himself. It was a cage, but it was a cage within a sanctuary. It was a price he was willing to pay. I understand, he said, his voice firm. He had a minor strength-enhancing quirk, he would tell them. One that was passive, barely noticeable. A lie of omission. Anya gave a curt nod. All right then. Welcome to Sector 7G, Izuku. Let's hope you're worth the risk. She turned and led him through the gate. The moment the massive doors slid shut behind him, sealing him inside, the change in atmosphere was breathtaking. The oppressive silence of the wasteland was replaced by the low hum of life. People bustled through the wide, repurposed corridors of the former mall. The air smelled not of dust and decay, but of soil, cooking food, and machine oil. Hydroponic farms, bathed in the glow of purple LED lights powered by salvaged solar arrays on the roof, lined the walls of what was once a department store. A group of people were attending a class in a former food court, learning how to repair a water filtration pump. This was more than he could have hoped for. It was order. It was purpose. It was a society, painstakingly reassembled from the wreckage. For the first time since he had woken up, Izuku felt the crushing weight on his shoulders lift, just slightly. He was assigned a small room, a former storage closet, with a cot and a single light bulb. It was a palace. His probationary work assignment began the next day. He was placed on a manual labor crew, tasked with clearing rubble from a collapsed section of the mall's east wing to make way for a new residential block. The work was grueling, but honest. He lifted heavy chunks of concrete, sorted twisted rebar, and pushed wheelbarrows filled with debris. He kept his strength carefully in check, using only the natural muscle he had rebuilt, never tapping into the vast reservoir of one for all that lay dormant within him. He was just another worker, another pair of hands. He learned the names of his crewmates, a former architect named Ben, a grizz old woman named Maria who had been a welder, a young man named Reese who was born just a year before the end and knew no other life. They were wary of him at first, this quiet, overly healthy newcomer, but his work ethic and his quiet, unassuming nature slowly began to win them over. It was during one of these work details that he met Kaido. Izuku was taking a water break, sitting on a pile of rubble, when a small figure darted out from behind a concrete pillar. It was a boy, no older than 7 or 8, with a mop of unruly black hair, big, curious eyes, and a smudge of dirt on his nose. He was one of the children he'd seen playing outside the walls. The boy stared at him, his head cocked to the side. "You're the new guy," he stated, his voice piping and clear. Izuku managed a small, rusty smile. "I guess I am. My name's Izuku, I'm Kaido," the boy said, puffing out his chest. He took a hesitant step closer. "My mom says you came from the wastes." "All by yourself?" "That's right," Izuku said. Kaido's eyes widened with awe. "Wow. Weren't you scared? Of the skags and the twitchers?" Izuku recognized the slang for the mutated creatures. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But you learn to be careful." Kaido seemed to consider this for a moment, then his eyes lit up with a new line of questioning. "Before the fall, were there really heroes?" The question hit Izuku like a physical blow. He felt his smile tighten. "Yes," he said, his voice a little strained. "There were. Like All Might?" Kaido whispered the name as if it were a sacred word. Izuku's heart clenched. "Yes. Like All Might." The boy's face was alight with a passionate, innocent fire that Izuku recognized with a pang of deep, personal nostalgia. It was the same fire that had burned in him as a child. "I found a book," Kaido said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "An old-world comic book. It showed him punching a monster so hard it changed the weather." "Could he really do that?" "He could," Izuku said, his voice thick with memory. He could see it so clearly, the triumphant smile, the fists raised to the sky, the rain starting to fall. Kaido stared at him, his gaze intense. "Anya says heroes are a myth. That their power is what broke everything. But my grandpa, he told me they were real. He told me they saved people." The boy took another step closer, his eyes fixed on Izuku's. "You're really strong. I saw you lift that big piece of concrete by yourself. The one Ben and Reese couldn't move together." Izuku's blood ran cold. He had been so careful. He thought he had kept his strength within human limits, but he had misjudged. The baseline of a normal person's strength in this world of rationing and hardship was lower than he'd accounted for. He had slipped up. I just have a knack for leverage," he stammered, trying to deflect. But Kaido wasn't listening. He had a one-track mind, filled with the wonder of a bygone age. Do you think the heroes will ever come back?" The question was so pure, so full of a desperate, childish hope, that it pierced through Izuku's carefully constructed defenses. He looked into the boy's wide, earnest eyes and saw a reflection of himself, a small, quirkless child staring up at a screen, praying for a hero. He started, but his voice failed him. He wanted to tell him yes. He wanted to promise him that a new age of heroes was coming. But all he could manage was the truth, or at least a version of it. "Heroes aren't about powers, Kaido," he said, his voice soft and heavy with the weight of his past. "They're about helping people. No matter what. And people like that, they'll always be around." Kaido seemed to accept this cryptic answer, his young face a mixture of disappointment and contemplation. He saw something in Izuku, a sadness, a strength, something that resonated with the stories his grandfather had told him. He saw a hero, even if Izuku didn't name himself as one. The moment was broken by a loud groan of stressed metal. A sudden, violent gust of wind, a common occurrence as the atmosphere slowly tried to rebalance itself, howled through the semi-demolished east wing. A large, precarious section of the ceiling, a tangle of concrete and rebar that the crew had been planning to bring down in a controlled demolition later that day, shifted under the strain. Izuku was on his feet in an instant, danger sense screaming a silent, high-pitched alarm in his mind. The structure was unstable. It was going to collapse, and it was directly above a small group of citizens, including Kaido, who had been sheltering from the wind near a support pillar. There was no time to shout a warning. No time to run. No time to think. There was only time to act. His training, his instincts, the very core of his being took over. He couldn't use a smash. He couldn't use Black Whip. Too overt. Too powerful. It would break the accords and reveal him completely. He needed something subtle. Something that could be explained away. Air Force. He pivoted on his heel, turning his back to the collapsing debris so that no one could see his face. He dropped into a low, powerful stance, planting his feet. He channeled a tiny, precise sliver of One for All, no more than 5%, into his arm. No green lightning. No fanfare. Just pure, contained power. He didn't punch. He thrust his open palm forward, fingers splayed, and released the energy not as a projectile, but as a sudden, violent displacement of air. A silent, invisible shockwave. The blast of compressed air was perfectly aimed. It struck the falling slab of concrete from the side. It wasn't enough to stop it, but it was enough to alter its trajectory. The massive chunk of debris, which had been on a path to crush the group below, was shunted sideways by the invisible force. It crashed to the ground a half-dozen feet to the left of them, shattering into 1,000 pieces with a deafening roar that sent a cloud of dust billowing through the chamber. The citizens screamed, scrambling away from the impact, their faces pale with shock and terror. Kaido was on the ground, having been knocked over by his mother, who had thrown herself over him. They were covered in dust, but they were alive. Unharmed. In the ensuing chaos of shouting and coughing, no one noticed Izuku's small, subtle movement. To everyone else, it looked like a freak accident. A gust of wind, a lucky break, a miracle. The unstable slab had just happened to fall in a way that missed them. But not everyone. From a high-level catwalk across the chamber, a figure had been observing the work crews. Anya. She had her tablet in hand, overseeing the structural surveys. She had seen the whole thing. Her eyes, sharp and analytical, hadn't been on the falling debris. They had been on him. She had seen him turn. She had seen the unnatural, rooted way he planted his feet. She had seen the tension in his shoulders, the brief, explosive movement of his arm. And in the swirling dust, just for a fraction of a second, she had seen it. A flicker, a tiny, momentary glint of emerald light in his eyes, a spark of power that had no business being there. While the others were celebrating their near miss, thanking their lucky stars, Anya's face was a mask of cold, hard certainty. Her worst suspicions had just been confirmed. Izuku was not just a fighter. He was not just strong. He possessed a power far beyond the scope of a minor strength-enhancing quirk, a power he had just used, with terrifying precision and control, right under her nose. The risk she had taken on him had just become a variable she could no longer calculate. Her gaze, fixed on the back of his head from across the chamber, was no longer just suspicious. It was filled with a deep, profound, and icy dread. Power like that wasn't a promise of a new worker. As she told him from the very beginning, it was a promise of destruction, and she had just invited it into the heart of her city.